SECfans.com, week 11, and we are going to discuss Alabama and Clemson if they played today. We've got a hypothetical discussion, hypothetical computer model, which just kind of crunches the numbers if they were to play today. Clemson fans, Alabama fans, if you haven't yet already, please hit that subscribe button. Helps us out a ton, and it'll help you to know when we get some interesting content out there, because this is the kind of content that people maybe aren't searching for, but is a really interesting discussion. We've had some hypotheticals this year, but there have been more outside the SEC. We've been doing a lot with the Big Ten this year and a lot with Notre Dame. So this one is going to feature an SEC team, and I think there was a time where Clemson was almost an SEC team. Want to give a trigger warning to Clemson fans. Sometimes we might slip and say Clemson. Sometimes we might get it right and say Clemson. Sometimes we might even not even say Etienne. We might say Etienne or something like that. Anyway, Josh is here with me. We're going to get nerdy about this game. We're going to get into the details because we are a numbers-driven channel. Let's talk about this first. Josh, can you spare me a moment for a rant before we get into this?
I'm usually good for 2 or 3 of those video.
Okay, so I've got a rant, and it's about scheduling, because what we've heard all year in regards to Alabama and Clemson is that they ain't played nobody, Paul. And the funny thing to me is, and what I keep saying, and what we keep saying on this show is, it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. Yes, playing a tough schedule matters. But the flip side of that, playing teams that aren't good, like if your schedule ends up, it falls in a way, like Notre Dame this year. We've said this time and time again. Notre Dame cannot help that the teams after Michigan have not been good, because Notre Dame scheduled name teams that are generally good every single year. Michigan hasn't played a great schedule. They're still in the top 5. They played that Notre Dame game. They've got that one connection. Alabama, up until LSU, not a good schedule. I'm going to say it right now, not a good schedule. But then now they beat LSU, and it's like, oh, well, maybe LSU wasn't good. So there's this constant banging on a schedule. Now it's happening with Clemson, and it's because, like Alabama, Clemson is the team that people are getting a little tired of, so they're picking them apart, and I think a little bit unfairly, because you can play a schedule full of crappy teams, especially if it's a Power 5 schedule, and it not say anything about who you are. You can still be a really, really good or elite team and just not have good teams on your schedule. It's how you handle your business along the way that gives an indication of whether or not you are an elite team. And I'm not saying that eye test or margin of victory is all that matters, but I am saying that it is an opportunity to separate yourself from a poor schedule. Am I saying anything crazy, or is this something you've heard and it's kind of frustrated you as well? Clemson and Alabama can be really good teams and play a schedule full of poor teams.
I mean, it's true, right? Who you play does not define whether or not you're good or bad. There's no magic switch that flips where when you beat a top 15 team, it instantly makes you good. And until you've beaten the top 15 team, you're terrible. That's just not reality. It's nonsensical. We like to question teams because I think a lot of times, in the national media or fan bases, there's a lot of times we don't want to believe the good teams are good. As our namesake as SEC fans, we're not SEC homers. We're not SEC bashers, or, that we like come in and want to talk about why your team's absolutely terrible. We're going to really nitpick in matchups, like if we're talking Alabama and Clemson, because any slight weakness in this game for either team is going to be magnified 100 times. But we deal so much in the comments from people that throw so much stuff at the SEC for scheduling, because it's the easiest way to discount why a team is good. The easiest way to say, well, Clemson isn't good, why Notre Dame isn't good this year, why Alabama isn't good, is that the schedule's not good. But when you're winning games 77-16, you don't do that if you're a terrible team. I'm sorry. You don't do it if you're not really good. So, yes, you can absolutely be a really good team and play a poor schedule. Where it matters to us when we're doing our analytical thing and our numbers-driven thing, we're going to be skeptical of things being a positive or a negative when you play a weak schedule. to the extent that the eye test or statistics don't show us that you're really, really good in a given area. An example of that, Clemson's rushing attack has to be really good, I think, for the most part when they played really good teams. But the fact that they ran for 2.8 yards per carry against North Carolina State, the fact that they ran for 3.6 yards per carry against Florida State, 3.6 yards per carry against Texas A&M, when we get those little tiny data points that say Clemson's really good running attack did not run the ball very well when they played really good run defenses, we can pick on that and say that's a real concern for Clemson when they get in the playoffs, because the teams they're going to play in the playoffs are going to have a run defense that's more like Florida State or A&M than, say, Wake Forest, who can't defend the run against anybody. So, yeah, I mean, you can take something from their negative schedule. You can nitpick, but to just throw out a team and say, Clemson's terrible, they'd never be able to score or run the ball, I mean, that's kind of, it's crap. And then the flip side to it, everybody wanted to throw out Alabama. Well, they haven't played a team that has a good defense, and nobody has a good pass defense. If you had watched Alabama and watched the way, it's not like they were scoring a lot or moving the ball well. Alabama was scoring, I think their average, they scored in every opening drive up until the LSU game, and they did it in an average of what was like 3.5 plays.
Right.
It was like a game to see if it took them 3 plays or 5 to score. And they did that for like the first 3 drives of every game. They could pretty much score at will. Strength of schedule doesn't really matter that much if you have that kind of, if you're that dominant.
Yeah, and we've watched this Alabama team for, we've been doing this show for 3 years. We know the difference between an Alabama team that just grinds out a bunch of points against a crappy team and an Alabama team that's doing stuff that we haven't ever seen. And to know that, whether you're a 5-star DB in an elite, considered elite passing team or a pass defensive team in the SEC or outside the SEC, or you're a 0-star DB for a crappy team and you're throwing on a 2 foot by 2 foot window, like, it doesn't matter how good or bad that guy is. If he's there and you're hitting throws in double coverage, like, you're still making good plays. The follow-up to this, I also want to say, and this leans more towards Alabama than it does towards Clemson, but it's going to happen this weekend after Clemson beats the crap out of Boston College. Spoiler alert, we're doing a Boston College Clemson preview video after this. I kind of tipped my hand a little bit. This other thing that I think, and I'm going to pick on fans that aren't, and this is inside the SEC too, pick on fans that aren't used to following a team like a Clemson or an Alabama that consistently dominates. What happens? They pick at the schedule, and then they say, you haven't played anybody. Let's see what happens when you play a really good team. And we heard that all week for Alabama. Let's see what happens when you play a really good team. There's no way you're going to cover 14 points, Death Valley at night. And Alabama beats the crap out of LSU, who we all know is a good team. But what happens immediately after that? Well, LSU sucks. LSU can't throw the ball. LSU's overrated. It's maddening to me to think that this is a thing that we're still doing, and we can't see when a team, just because, going back to saying that you can be decoupled from a bad schedule and be a good team, just because you blow somebody out, it doesn't mean that other team is bad. We've seen really good teams blow out really good teams because they were just that much better. Is that another fair thing to say?
Yeah, I mean, it is. And I think something our channel historically has done the best job of, I feel like, is picking out games where we feel like these are 2 really good teams, but it's going to be a blowout because Team A is really just that much better than Team B, or Team A has some massive matchup advantage over Team B.
What was our margin that we picked? Like 23 and 24, and the margin was 29.
Yeah,
for the LSU
so our model had a 27-point win for Alabama. I picked it, I think, 24 points, and you picked it something like 23. I'll look it up now rather than just saying. You had a 24-point win. I had a 23-point win. The model had it a 27-point win. It was a 29-point win. Another good example we did out of conference in a game that didn't even involve the SEC was Michigan-Wisconsin. In that Michigan-Wisconsin game, see if I can find that one because it's been a few weeks now. uh, I think our model had that 40-13, and yeah, our model was 40-13. I had it 31-10. The actual was 38-13. So our model was off by 2 points. Yeah, we had that fairly well pegged in a game that a lot of people sort of at the time perceived to be a very close game because there were lots of signs that Wisconsin had struggled with bad teams, lost to a bad team in BYU. All of that really comes down to the fact that, yeah, Clemson may not have played a great schedule to date. Yeah, Alabama may not have played a great schedule to date, though the LSU game is an exception. That does not mean that Clemson won't blow out a lot of teams. It doesn't mean if Clemson plays Notre Dame today, I don't know how close that game really is. And there's a reason we're doing a model, I think, on Alabama and Clemson for that reason at the moment. Clemson's a really good team. Now, I do think within that bounds, you do have to be careful because as much as Clemson's really good and Alabama's really good, there is stuff you can pick at both teams from the way they've played and the way they've dominated or not dominated. Alabama has dominated on both sides of the ball, run and pass in every game. They gave up some points early in the season, but they gave up points in huge blowouts, and they didn't give them up with any consistency. And that's because Alabama to this point has been, whether or not I'm not saying they're a historically good team, they are a historically dominant team. No one in about 15, no one in not about 15, no one in 15 years has won games through 9 games has won at this rate, the way Alabama has in a Power 5 conference. Clemson has not done that consistently to the same level. There's a lot more to nitpick with Clemson than Alabama because of that.
All right, and one of the places that I guess we need to go ahead and talk about the transitive property common opponent, and that's Texas A&M. And Alabama fans are going to be frustrated with this because I'm going to say, yes, there are some things that I think you can draw from that game in favor of Alabama relative to Clemson, but it's more of a global thing than it is this specific game, in that Alabama hasn't had a close game this year. Like you said, Alabama hasn't been in tight with any team in the fourth quarter this year. So the Texas A&M game is no exception to that. I will say, though, that was a completely different Clemson team. And they were playing on the road at night against a team that was undefeated. A&M, when they got to Alabama, were still pretty high. Like, they were still flying high into that game. They still had confidence in that game. And Mond was a completely different quarterback. Against Clemson and Alabama, Kellen Mond was he was out of his mind against Clemson. He was really good against Alabama. And I have this theory about him that he's one of these kinds of quarterbacks who, when he knows that when it's a defeatist mentality, when he knows that they're going to lose the game, he has no pressure on him and he goes out there and just tears it up. But when the pressure's on for a game that they're expected to win, mentally he breaks down. We saw it against Auburn this weekend. They got up on him really big in the first half, and in the second half, he was a disaster. So I don't think you can say, hey, Clemson, you only beat Texas A&M by 2 points. Alabama crushed them. Therefore, you're not as good as Alabama. I will say, hey, Clemson, you've had 2 games this year, and I know Trevor Lawrence was hurt against Syracuse, and I know Trevor Lawrence was just getting his feet under him, getting his sea legs against A&M, so they're not the same offense per se, but they did have the same defense. And I will say, in that regard, the fact that they've had 2 close games this year versus the fact that Alabama hasn't had anybody come close to them, and I think Alabama's played a little bit tougher schedule, a lot bit tougher schedule, I think that's probably in Alabama's favor.
It is, and as much as we've just harped on it, I think also you have to sort of keep some perspective on the quality of the teams you've played and what all it means. The one point at this one game so far that I think maybe is the defining win for Clemson is probably that NC State blowout over a team that at the time was ranked and is still S&P, I think 27th. Outside that game, they have not played a top 40 team. So, Syracuse for a bit there looked like they were going to be pretty good. They've fallen down to 44th. That was, and you can't really say too that was just being good for a little while and falling off. Florida State's not very good. Louisville was really bad when they played Alabama, and we on our channel called that to be a massive blowout. Not because we thought Alabama. Well, one, we thought Alabama was really good, but two, we had zero confidence. Especially, I had zero confidence in Louisville this year whatsoever. I think I also gave a segment, did I not, on the fact that I was cautious if Petrino was going to go back in history. There's a trend with Petrino where he collapses after so many years, and it has to do with recruiting, and he loses a quarterback, and the offense sort of falls off, and then they become terrible. And it just so happens, really outside this one example I pulled from many years ago, that he's jumped to another school every time he gets to that point. This was the first year he stayed. And did I or did I not point out the fact that this was a year Petrino was likely to have field a terrible football team?
Yeah, and the few Louisville fans that were in on that in the comment section were kind of killing us for it.
Yeah, well, we don't want to do things to run people off on this channel, but it was realistic. It was founded based off historical data. You can go back and watch the Alabama LSU preview or Louisville preview if you're a Clemson fan, just to hear me sort of spell that out and read the comments from the Louisville fans that thought it was ridiculous. But Clemson's schedule, I think the real concern is, I don't think Texas A&M and the Clemson game was the same one, but I don't think A&M was the same team that they are now either. They were a better team to start the year, and they've fallen off a cliff the way they have the past few years. NC State in particular, that team is really hard to peg down. I said it's probably the best win they have, but if you look at their schedule, it was Georgia. Because of the hurricane, they ended up playing Georgia State, Marshall, Virginia. They missed that game with West Virginia that might have completely changed. I think they were the ones, right, that had that West Virginia game canceled.
They did.
Yeah, and then that completely changed our viewpoint on that team. They had a close win over Boston College, which is a good sign for Clemson. But after that, they get blown out by Clemson. They lose to they are a bad Syracuse team, frankly. And then, 47-28 was a blowout against Florida State, but they let Florida State score 28 points in a ball game. So I don't know how good NC State is either. Now, we just spent an eternity telling you why you can play weak teams and still be really good. Clemson dominated that game, so I can't take anything overly negative from it, and I'm not. But, all I'm really getting at is Clemson has shown that they're at least pretty darn good because they've handled business week in and week out. I cannot say how good Clemson really is because there are a lot of signs that outside the A&M game, which was a very close game, they are truly untested. And just like we talked about with Alabama's passing game, we didn't know where the ceiling was for that passing game and how it was going to translate because we had no idea what it was going to look like against a good secondary. We both thought, based off the eye test, that it was going to be pretty darn good. I will say with Trevor Lawrence, and I'll turn it back to you so I don't ramble on too long here. It's a lot harder to project Clemson because they've relied way more on the run game. They've had really big games from Etienne, where he had crazy yardage against weak teams, but struggled against good ones. And similarly, Lawrence has had crazy games against really weak secondaries, but has not produced week in, week out against better secondaries.
And just clarify to everybody, we're not saying that Trevor Lawrence is bad.
No,
at all.
No. Yeah, it's going back to the point we really tried to build this foundation. It's not that Trevor Lawrence is bad. It's that it's really hard to evaluate Trevor Lawrence because as much as Alabama played some really bad pass defenses, and they really did, we saw things from Tua where he was throwing seam routes where he had to make a couple reads, go through a progression, and then he would throw a play where you've really got to hit a window between the linebacker and RPO or on a seam route, or he's throwing deep breaking crossers and that kind of thing. I haven't seen Lawrence fail to hit those plays that much, though I will say he went through a stretch in the middle of the year where he was having a hard time with his deep balls. But they're not asking Lawrence to try to do those throws. They're giving him easy throws, which are good for confidence, but those short passes are not going to be there when you play a playoff caliber team because they're going to play press man against Clemson's receivers. No one to this point has been able to deal with T. Higgins really outside of Florida State at all. So I don't know. It's an interesting dynamic and makes Clemson hard to peg down.
All right. So we have this 3 years in a row history of Alabama and Clemson, and one of the things that was Great for Clemson was Deshaun Watson, and last year we saw that they offensively they just couldn't do anything against Alabama. And everybody said, and they were correct when they said that the move away from Kelly Bryant was the only way that Dabo saw that Clemson would have a shot against an Alabama in the playoffs. And they're to the level now that they're not playing for conference championships anymore. They're playing for national title or bust. And they are going to moonwalk through the rest of their schedule. They're going to kill South Carolina at the end of the year. As much as it pains me to say it, as someone who is married to a South Carolina grad, they are going to murder the rest of their schedule. And right now, Pitt is leading the Coastal Division, so we kind of know what to expect the rest of the way. I don't know. They're not. So it's going to be 1-2 if Alabama wins out. So they're going to face either like a Michigan or a Notre Dame, a good defensive team, before they play in Alabama. Don't you want to see Trevor Lawrence get these reps now against? Because you mentioned that he gets a lot of these confidence builders. But don't you want to see him get these tougher reps now against a team where if he throws an interception, doesn't matter because they're going to score on the next drive anyway. Or if they need to, they can run it and get another touchdown if they need to. Don't you want to see him do some of this now because he's going to have to do it against a Michigan or have to do it against an Alabama?
Well, you do. But I mean, the difficulty for Clemson, it's kind of a weird problem. They're not going to get many great opportunities to test him. I mean, given the way that the ACC is gone, that it's a bad conference. And, I mentioned Syracuse and saying North Carolina State was the big sort of win. Syracuse was not ranked that high at the time. They're ranked now. North Carolina State was a team ranked higher, probably got them more cachet. It's just none of the teams in the conference have much to build off of. I mean, you look at Syracuse's schedule, they only have 2 losses. I get that. They're ranked, top 15 right now. This is not me being an SEC homer to say I don't think it's justified. Wins over Florida State, UConn, Western Michigan,
3-point win over North
Carolina. I mean, Wake Forest team that's terrible. North Carolina State, they won by 10, and we already discussed the fact that North Carolina State's schedule is entirely backloaded, and I think they're going to turn out to be a pretty poor team. And then they lost to Pitt, and they lost to Clemson. So I don't know how you test Trevor Lawrence. Like, with this schedule, how can you make it happen?
I mean, you've got to test him in practice, I guess. I mean, he's facing a good defense in
right.
practice.
I mean, it's not Clemson's fault that the rest of the ACC is bad. And they are. And it's not an indictment on Clemson that they're bad, which has been much of the show to this point. It's not Clemson's fault. It just is what it is. The rest of the ACC is bad. It'd be good if you could test Trevor Lawrence and get him game ready. They haven't been able to do that. They were able to get some reps against Florida State. They kind of came on later in that game, though. Again, that was kind of tough. More than anything, it was teams haven't really been able to deal with T. Higgins. But they're doing the best job they can, I think. I would like to see them force Lawrence to be more aggressive, but I think they're running the style of offense they're comfortable running with a true freshman, and they're just going to end up being basically being stuck in a situation where they're not going to be able to see what their offense really looks like, and they're not going to be able to test the poor guy until really at no point in the season. Because I mean, Pitt's pass defense is pretty poor too. They've given up, over 9 yards per attempt to Duke. I just don't see it happening. I don't see any way Clemson's able to do it with their schedule for no fault of their own.
All right, so the flip side of this is also true, though. Like, let's assume Clemson's offense is every bit of that 77-16 we saw against Louisville and every bit of what we've seen so far, and that there isn't really that fool's gold because of poor schedule, and that they are just an elite offense. Alabama's defense will not have seen an elite passing game up to that point, including first round of the playoffs, unless Oklahoma backs into the 4th slot. Alabama will not have seen an elite passing game until if they meet Clemson in the national championship game. Could they potentially be shell shocked? And I know you're going to say Jake Fromm. But that style of offense, Jim Chaney's offense to me and Jake Fromm, that is more of a strict pro style offense, and they took a step back in the running game this year. Is there the potential? And I know I say this as someone who's followed Alabama and knows that they don't really get shell shocked, but is there a potential for them to kind of get caught flat footed against an offense that really there won't be any good film on them because they've blown everybody out? And they haven't been able to prepare and play against a team that can execute like this offensively.
I think there's a pretty good chance of it. And I will say, as much as Alabama has not played great defenses, if you look at, it's actually the unnamed opponent. So Louisiana Lafayette is a pretty good offense. And S&P, they're ranked 17th nationally. Their defense is horrible, which is why they're not a very good team overall. But that's a solid passing game. And I think Arkansas State, I think they fell off. There was a point where they were ranked pretty high, but yeah, they're all the way down to 62nd now. But yeah, no, they haven't played by any means an elite offense. We've seen Alabama get shell shocked before. We were discussing this in regard to LSU versus Alabama, that we were kind of curious if that was going to happen. When Alabama came in a number of bowl games, Alabama versus Utah many years ago, they got shell shocked. I think they got shell shocked when they had the big Johnny Manziel loss in 2012, and they came out and they kind of thought they knew what they were, ready for, what they were going to face, and it was just a completely different speed and a completely different quality than they were anticipating, and they were completely on their heels. And that happens to defenses when, for the first time, when they come up against a really, really good offense. I think there's a chance that Alabama could be kind of shell shocked because they haven't faced a passing game that's nearly that effective. They haven't faced a run game really that's that effective, though. Again, as we said, there's some hints to the fact that run game, if you have a speed-based run game, I will say, as a quick aside, and that's what they have with Etienne, it often doesn't translate very well when you don't have run lanes because he's not going to break tackles. So if you don't have an open lane, you tend to get stuffed. It's the Bryce Love problem with Stanford, where his production just disappeared when the offensive line couldn't dominate. Doesn't mean you don't have a good team or don't have a good back. It's kind of a problem with really good defensive lines. But Alabama in that game absolutely could end up in a situation where the secondary is giving up plays. You start to sort of question yourself. Their linebackers have gotten lost at times this year. And Clemson has a style of offense to really spread them out, make guys play on an island, and things that never got stressed in the regular season. Maybe maybe the dime safety in gets stuck in man coverage in a 5 wide set against Clemson, and at no point this year was anybody able to force them into that situation. And then Clemson has the depth at receiver to actually get get a Renfro on that guy, and then maybe they're able to exploit it. And Alabama has to find a way to adjust. They get put in, they're doing things defensively they haven't done all year. It all kind of snowballs. So you see that sometimes. So I think it's a fair observation and definitely something that can happen.
All right, so why don't you go ahead and get the numbers, and I will add. I know that I posed this question of Alabama being shell shocked. I think most defenses are going to be a little bit shell shocked against Tua in this Alabama offense, kind of like we said last year when Georgia was struggling in the first half against Oklahoma. It is impossible to prepare comprehensively for a quarterback that is that good. And so I think the same is also true for the Clemson defense. I should have mentioned that because I know Alabama fans would kill me in the comments if I didn't. But let's go ahead and get into the numbers and let's see what the model says. And just so everybody knows, we don't do predictions. You and I don't do predictions and hypotheticals because it is a hypothetical. They may not even play. And if they do play, we're definitely going to do a video. So we'll give our predictions then.
So the first thing we do with our model is we generate an intermediate statistic called percentage is allowed, or a percentage of opponent average is allowed. So it's completely relational. And I will say them as a whole, we have a video on the model. You can search for it on our channel where we go into more depth about it. But the model is designed to be an even baseline. If both teams play their B+ game, we'll say, what does that look like based off their past history, completely compensated for opponent quality, and based off their own averages. So the first neutral, so this is a clean neutral statistic, is percentage of opponent averages allowed. Clemson allows teams to have 55% of their opponent rush averages as a statistic. Alabama allows teams to have 75%. We generally say anything below 75% is elite. We've talked about many times you can get that number quite low if you're really good defense. 55% is insane. That number is as good as you'll ever see. And Alabama has done that in the past, but Clemson this year is that good on rush defense. I will say there's, again, it's all a little relative when you're looking at teams in different conferences. ACC and the SEC are pretty isolated, especially at this point in the year. So, the numbers in the SEC rush averages are all formed against SEC teams. The ACC rush averages are formed against ACC teams. There is no way for me to magically make that problem go away absent ACC teams playing the SEC teams and giving us some data points. There's a couple of those that will come up with Georgia, Georgia Tech, Clemson, South Carolina. The only really good ones we have at this point, LSU versus Miami, Louisville versus Alabama. Both those games were blowouts, such that it's kind of hard for us to use that. So anyway, both these teams have elite rush defenses, and you can say 55%, 75%. But the short answer is that neither one of these teams has really let their opponents run the ball overly well. And Alabama's, I will say, has gotten 75% is almost deceptive because they're the second half of the season, they've been much better than they were the first half of the season. The flip side of this is opponent averages passing the ball. So Alabama allows teams 79% of their pass averages. Clemson allows 83%. It's much harder to keep a team from getting their passing averages than it is the run. We see run defenses all the time get in the 50s and 60s. We never see pass defenses get in the 50s and 60s. I think 2016 Alabama got there or got close to it. But that was about the only time we've ever seen it. And even they fell off right at the end of the year when they had that injury to Eddie Jackson, who's now with the Chicago Bears. They weren't quite as good. But that I will say the 83% for Clemson is deceptive. And the reason for that is we're talking about percentage, what you do relative to your opponent's yard per attempt average. So not ignoring volume. To this point, when we do this video, Clemson we throw out FCS teams entirely because an FCS rushing average was formed against FCS teams. I can't use it. None of the relational data is in any way meaningful, so I scrub it completely. Clemson played two triple option teams, Georgia Southern, Georgia Tech. As of this time, they both have over 10 yards per attempt average. That doesn't mean anything because they throw on average, I think, between the two of them about 3 passes a game. So yes, they have a high yard per attempt average because they're all deep shots that they almost never take. If I take those two games out and I set that more towards what Clemson's allowing, like if I set them to 7 each, Clemson's pass defense number actually goes all the way up to 92%. So those two teams are skewing this number badly. And we'll get into what that means in a bit. I will say it doesn't affect scoring that much, but it does mean the pass defense is not really 82%. It's actually probably over 90 properly. And those two triple option teams skew our model, and I'm gonna have to think about a way to correct that in the future. Anyway, long story short, what does that look like? Well, what it basically suggests is that Alabama would not be able to run the ball, would be able to throw it quite well. It would predict that Alabama would run for 3 yards per carry and throw for 10 yards per attempt. It predicts that Clemson would run for 5.2 yards per carry, but only throw for 6.5 yards per attempt. 6.5 yards per attempt is what we consider competent throwing the ball. 4.5 yards per attempt is what we consider competent running it. So basically, Alabama would not have a competent running game. Clemson would. Alabama would have a very effective passing game. Clemson would be just effective at passing the ball. Now our model builds a unique scoring model to each team. So basically, what kind of scoring production have you gotten this year based off your own production this year? It's not like a linear model. It's not just taking yards per play and converting it into points, and drawing a straight line. It's like a big multivariate curve that generates itself by the computer. It does factor in some things like special teams and field position to a certain extent. It doesn't have direct variables, but to the extent something like turnovers or a statistic, or again, the 2016 team is an example. When you score on special teams or defensive touchdowns, to the extent that it becomes a trend, that does show up in our scoring model. It has Alabama 42, Clemson 35. So a 7-point win for Alabama in a game where Clemson runs the ball fairly well, passes it fairly well, to where the offense is moving it, but not moving it necessarily great, just moving it competently. Alabama would have to depend on the pass quite a bit in that game to be able to beat Clemson. As we said, it's a little questionable maybe how well that would work. Syracuse had some success. Alabama's passing game is phenomenal. Alabama week in and week out has been as good as Deshaun Watson and Wallace and that group was with Deion Kane when they were the best they were ever at. That's where or Alabama has been pretty much every week this year, and their receiving core is just as good as those units. So it's 42 points for Alabama is entirely feasible. Just like, again, we mentioned the 2016 team, 2016 Alabama or 2015 Alabama. 2015 Alabama gave up 40 plus to Clemson. 2016 couldn't keep Clemson from scoring either. That's what happens when you face a Heisman caliber quarterback. But I think the notable thing is that Clemson would be projected to score 35 because Clemson has a great offense to their own right. The last thing I will say before I turn it back over to my co-host here, that 35-point projection for Clemson is more than slightly speculative for the model. And it gets that from two numbers I'll tell you in particular. I can peg right where the model's looking historically to build its scoring model. Clemson had 5.7 yards against Syracuse and scored 27. They had 5.9 yards per play against North Carolina State, and they scored 41. So this is projecting them right between the yardage, right at the yardage, right between the Syracuse game and the North Carolina State game. And unsurprisingly, it's more or less splitting the difference. 14-point difference, add 7, split it. What do you end up with? 34, 35 points. That's where the model's getting this from. I'm a little skeptical of that because the North Carolina in the Syracuse game, Clemson was able to run the ball at will. Syracuse run defense is not very good. And when they needed it, Etienne was always able to deliver. And in the North Carolina State game, we've already discussed, I think North Carolina State's pass defense, we're recording this now going into, we got 3 games left in the regular season. I think they're going to continue to be kind of exposed, frankly. And if I'm right with that, Clemson was able to essentially pass the ball whenever they wanted. Well, I say that. I'm looking at their schedule now. North Carolina State does not play anybody of any note for the rest of the year. So that's probably not going to happen. But yeah, both those games, Clemson had a serious matchup edge that they would not have against Alabama. So that does give me, as much as it's saying this is a one-score win, I am a little hesitant of that because the model is basing it off 2 games where Clemson had something they could always rely on to get points and yards. And conversely, against Texas A&M, they had 7 yards per play, so much better production, about 25%, roughly about 20% better offensive production than they're projected to have against Alabama. And they had to really work to score 28. They would not be nearly as productive offensively as they were in that A&M game. So that's maybe some cause for concern that they wouldn't actually score 35.
Yeah, I think the 35 is high, but I also think the 42 might be high for Alabama. One of the things that we see with Alabama, and when we do these averages, they're kind of in isolation in that if you get this many yards per play relative to how you've played in the past, this is what we expect you to score. This is what the model expects you to score. The problem with that is Alabama, and I know they score fast, but Alabama is going to have to deal with an offense that's maybe not going 3 and out all day. And that is something that really we haven't seen with Alabama. And I know that they've faced some better offenses, but they haven't faced at Clemson. So we talk about how many times you have to get Alabama to punt to keep them under 40. And I don't think the LSU game was entirely fair comparison because relative to yardage, and I think if Tua is healthy, I think Alabama scores in the 40s in that game. And I think those defenses are pretty similar, but the offenses are so dissimilar, in one being completely unsuited to face an Alabama defense, and the other being suited to put up some points on anybody. I wonder what the LSU game looks like with that defense if LSU could score, let's say, 27 on Alabama. They don't score in the 40s. That's a 27 to 38 type of game. Right. And I think Clemson fans might be thinking right now, okay, you're saying your model says 42-35, but you're saying that Clemson might score less and that there's some things that you don't totally trust in the model right now. And they're rolling their eyes saying, okay, whatever, SEC homers picking Alabama with a big win. We're not picking them with a big win. Again, we're not making a projection here, but what we're saying is we just finished predicting a 27 point in our model win for Alabama. They won by 29. You and I both picked in the 20s for the margin in that game. Didn't nail the score right, but picked the margin. I'm saying probably a single digit game right now. And I think given how Alabama's playing right now, given the unknowns around Clemson, that is a massive, massive respect to Clemson to say that would be a single digit game. What do you think?
I totally agree with that. And I think early in the year, I was critical of the decision to bench Bryant in some videos we did for Lawrence. The A&M game, in my opinion, Bryant won for Clemson. And I think most people, if you watched it, would agree with that. I mean, he had, I think Bryant scored on 3 out of 8 drives. Lawrence scored on 1 of 5. And Lawrence had that long touchdown pass but in the other 4 possessions, he had 1 first down. It was kind of thrown away possessions. Probably would have been better off to have not played him in that game, frankly, because he wasn't quite ready. But what Clemson has done is they've slowly worked on trying to get him ready. I think something we spent a lot of time talking about is as much as they've really wanted to work to get him ready, and it is actually weirdly an unfortunate thing for Clemson is they haven't played teams that are good enough to really give them the chance to push Lawrence to evolve him. But, relative to this game, this 42-35, I think sort of 2 things I'm going to point to. The first is I think the next game after we do this video, the Alabama-Mississippi State game, and I can say this now because we don't know what the outcome's going to be. You should draw a lot from that game because I think Clemson is a lot more similar to Mississippi State defensively than they are LSU. I think LSU's secondary has multiple high-end NFL draft picks. And when I say high-end, I mean like Delpit's going to have probably a serious discussion as a first-round draft pick at safety. Greedy Williams is going to be a first- or second-round corner. The opposite corner, Fulton, may be a first- or second-round corner. I mean, there's a crazy amount of talent on that LSU secondary. Probably all of them are NFL players. The better example, I think, is Mississippi State. Because Mississippi State's front is better than LSU's front. Mississippi State's front is more disruptive. They're more physical than LSU's front. LSU's front's good. It's not phenomenal, and it's not consistent across the board. Sweat, Green, and Simmons, I don't know that they're as good as the Clemson unit, but they're probably the closest thing the SEC has to that Clemson unit in terms of size, physicality, and ability to disrupt with like Farrell and company. So that game is going to tell you a lot. If Alabama can block that front and still be able to score a lot, that's going to tell you that's probably going to translate against Clemson. If Alabama struggles with a front that's a lot more disruptive, that's a lot more physical, that same thing is probably going to happen to Clemson because LSU is not a very good, they're one of the worst teams in the conference in terms of tackles for loss. They're not very disruptive. They rely on their secondary blanketing you until they can finally get to the quarterback or forcing a throw into coverage. Mississippi State relies on their pressure in front, not giving the quarterback time to throw, and you not being able to execute. That's what you want to see from Alabama to give you an idea of how they're going to translate to the Clemson game. But I will move to the second point. As much as I say that, you should take however Alabama does against Mississippi State and then always keep in your back of your mind that with the version you're going to see against Clemson is probably going to be a couple notches better. And the reason for that is Tua, we've talked about quite a bit. We just did a Mississippi State preview. Tua is not right. Since he tweaked his knee, he's consistently throwing the ball high. There's some issues with him statistically and otherwise where he immediately got worse in a clear and consistent way where until his knee's fixed and he can get that brace off, it's probably going to continue. and Alabama's receiving core may play with one of three starters, and if they have two of them, you're guaranteed the second starter is going to be really banged up in this Mississippi State game. They should all be healthy by Clemson, so they're not going to face the same offense that Mississippi State's going to face this week.
All right, so I've got one more question on this, and then we can shut it down because it's been a long one for a hypothetical. But let's assume these teams are 1 and 2. They don't play until the national championship game, which means both of them have the short week to prepare for one another instead of the 1-4-2-3 matchup where you have the whole month to prepare for the team you're going to play. What is the biggest concern for Alabama? So the biggest potential place that Clemson will be able to make Alabama struggle, either offensively or defensively. And then what's the biggest place that you think Alabama can really potentially expose Clemson, either offensively or defensively?
I think the biggest thing Alabama can do to expose Clemson would be in dominating Clemson's run game. I think that's probably the biggest thing. It goes back to the statement I made. If there's one thing to nitpick against Clemson, and there's not much, just like there's not much against Alabama, who's dominated everyone they've played on both sides of the ball all year. Clemson has by and large dominated everyone except the Syracuse game. And I give him a serious pass for that because of all the weird circumstances. Lawrence being hurt, going out of the game. Though I do note that he wasn't terribly effective before he went out, so you can't throw that away entirely. But it's the fact that Clemson's rushing offense in multiple games this year, A&M, North Carolina State, and Florida State, when they've played an above-average rush defense, has not been able to produce. And so I think there is a very good chance, given that Alabama's front is better than A&M, North Carolina State, or Florida State, that Clemson would not be able to run the ball if and when they play Alabama. They will have to throw the ball, and importantly, they were going to have to throw the ball from a one-dimensional offense, which is something that Lawrence has pretty much had the luxury of not ever having to deal with.
All right, y'all, that's going to wrap it up for our Clemson and Alabama hypothetical. Mix it up in the comments. Let us know what you think. You can go ahead and give your score prediction. We don't do ours for hypotheticals, but would love to see what you guys think about this one, where you think it would head if these two teams met today. Obviously, if these two teams play, we will do a preview on it. But until then, thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.